What do the markings on a runway tell a pilot when they're trying to land? Today, we're talking about runway pavement markings. So I feel like I owe some explanation and why I'm qualified to even talk about this. I'm not the traditional civil engineer in transportation. I'm an airport engineer, and I've worked on this stuff for almost 8 years now. Now, this isn't engineering advice, and this is a high-level overview of what these markings mean. So I may not go into excruciating detail about what these exactly mean, but I want to give you a general idea of what these markings tell pilots. So let's talk about what makes a runway a runway. So just like when you're driving down the road and you understand that the double yellow center line means you can't pass on that portion of the road, or the white fog line helps you maintain your position on the lane, the runway markings at an airport tell the pilots a lot of different information that helps them land and take off safely. There are 8 main types of markings on runways. Those markings include the designator, the runway center line, the edge markings, the shoulder markings, threshold and threshold bar marking, the displaced threshold markings, the aiming point markings, the touchdown zone markings, and the blast pad, stopways, and engineered material arresting system markings. Each of these markings serves a purpose to give information to the pilots to help them land or take off safely. For instance, the designator at the end of a runway identifies a specific runway for pilots to land on. This number is determined by the compass heading. Therefore, if there are multiple runways in parallel to each other, these runways would have the same number and will need a L, C, or R depending on how many runways there are to determine which one is the left runway, the center runway, or right runway. The center line marking helps a pilot line up with the center of a runway, like you would expect, and it also helps the pilots judge the speed of the aircraft, because a lot of the times airports are in wide open spaces and there aren't a lot of reference objects around all the time to determine how fast you're going. Next are the runway edge markings, which help the pilot determine the usable width of pavement for the runway. These are important not only for helping identify runways at distance, but also when the airplane needs to turn around on the runway to keep their tires on full strength pavement, because it's not very good to have a 100,000-pound plane put its tire off into the gravel. Doesn't usually end very well. And building off the runway edge markings, we also have the runway shoulder markings, which are yellow stripes helping identify where the full strength pavement ends and lower strength shoulder pavement may begin, because that pavement isn't designed to hold the full weight of all these aircraft. Next up is the threshold marking, which identifies the end of a runway with a series of parallel lines symmetric about the center line of the runway. This marking is fairly large and really helps pilots understand where a runway actually begins. And determining where a runway actually begins can also be enhanced using a threshold bar, which is a white stripe at the end of a runway in addition to the threshold markings, to identify the exact end of the runway. Where the paint begins, the runway begins. And this threshold bar is especially important in precision runways and also in runways with displaced thresholds. A displaced threshold is marked with arrows down the center line of the runway pointing towards the threshold bar. The most likely reason for a displaced threshold would be obstructions to the approach for aircraft landing on that runway end, meaning the runway end needs to be pushed further down the pavement to be usable and still clear these obstructions. Now you may wonder why we don't just shorten the pavement. Well, that's because when you're taking off from that runway end and not landing on that end, you can still use that pavement to take off and get speed. So there is only a reduced use based on landing, not necessarily takeoff from that end of the runway. Now further into the precision markings is the aiming point markings. These are large rectangular boxes at about 1,020 feet down the runway. These boxes are obviously an aiming point for pilots to aim for when approaching a runway. And also similar to aiming point markings are touchdown zone markings, which are pairs of series of white rectangles, starting with a series of 3 rectangles on either side of the runway. Then at 500 feet spacings, it goes to 2 white rectangles on either side of the runway, another set of 2 at 500 additional feet, and then a set of 1 on either side, and finally a final set of 1 on either side, which can be reduced depending on runway length, and there are a lot of other factors, but that is the ultimate configuration for touchdown zone markings. These touchdown zone markings do exactly what they sound like they do. They give pilots a reference to how far down the runway they are when they're touching down to the runway. Now, the touchdown zone markings aren't the end-all be-all for determining how far down the runway they are. It's just a reference, and there are also additional signs and other things that help the pilot identify how quickly they need to stop before they reach the end of the runway, which I plan on talking about in future videos when we talk about lights and signs and other systems that help pilots land safely. And the final markings, which are not necessarily directly in assistance to helping a pilot land, but they do protect a pilot or an airplane from going into areas that are not allowable for them to be in. But what are these things? These yellow chevron markings identify blast pads, stopways, and engineered materials arresting systems. A blast pad is an area that is paved over or protected in some way from blowing debris by the jets that are taking off, blowing them into roads or nearby communities or whatever the case may be. A stopway is an emergency additional area of pavement that should never be used unless in the case of an emergency, kind of similar to a runaway truck ramp, but there's no additional help in stopping the airplane. It's just additional pavement that can be used only in an emergency. And finally, the engineered material arresting system, which is the runaway truck ramp for airplanes that is designed to keep them from entering public areas or areas where they can endanger the general public, but also protecting the safety of the passengers. So if you've noticed, not all runways have all of these markings. Not all of these markings are required for every application. For instance, small airports in small towns that only operate small aircraft or aircraft that only land visually. There's nothing else assisting these airplanes to land on this runway. These runways only require the designator and the runway center line and nothing else. These runways leave it up to the pilot to land safely, but these are primarily found in very small towns or very small airports that don't have a lot of traffic. These basic runways are considered visual runways. More commonly, at least for me and my work, are the non-precision approach runways, which typically consist of the designator, the runway center line, just like the visual runway, and then in addition, they include the runway edge stripes, the threshold bar, and the aiming point markings. Not all of those are applicable to every single scenario in this case, but those are the ultimate applications of markings for a non-precision approach runway. Types of places that would have these are slightly larger municipalities that may have some additional instrumentation to help pilots land on those runways. And finally, the highest level marking application for runways is the precision approach runway, which includes all of the markings that we've talked about today, except for the chevron markings if not needed. There are some other markings on a runway, like the lead-on, lead-off markings, but I'm going to talk about those markings in a future video when I talk about taxiway markings and how airplanes get from the terminal or aprons or wherever they're at to the runway. Now obviously the markings don't give you all the information, just in the same way you need signs and lights and other things to help convey all of the information you need to operate safely. And I'm planning on going into further depth on what these other things are that convey additional information beyond the markings in future videos, so stick around. So I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you learned something about runways. And if you want to know anything more about construction, civil engineering, airports, or whatever else you might think I know the answer to, leave it down below in the comments. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.